Okay, so this is the last one I have as of the recording of these, which I'm doing on Sunday morning. So it says, can you please say more about the Beta/Beth symbolism? I didn't notice much except for the fact that he's a singer and was called Half Moon or something. Yeah, so I'm happy to say more about this. And I had to kind of think my way back through it because it's been a while since I revisited the Beta symbolism. It's very obvious that he was meant to be... it's not even so much a proxy as an anti-parallel, or in literature we call it a foil, which just means that they're the same in that they have parallels, but they're also the opposite of one another. And the attributes in one bring out the opposite attributes in another. So what that means is, let's look at like Rick and the Governor. Obviously they were enemies, but they were also foils, and both of them, they're similar in that they're leaders. They're good at getting people to follow them. They actually do establish communities and people who love them and are faithful to them. But they also have opposite qualities in that the governor was really shady and he was doing bad things behind closed doors, not only keeping walkers in tanks, but he was hurting people. He was being kind of underhanded about things. And so the negative aspects of his character and his leadership brought out the positive aspects of Rick in the same way. So they are very similar, but also opposites. Okay, so that's what I think was going on with Beta back in season, it would have been 10. But it's not just him. He's not the only one that you need to look at. Beta and Alpha were actually foils for Beth and Daryl. Their relationship, it had some compelling aspects, even though they were bad guys, they were villains, and the relationship was a little twisted for sure. But that's exactly the point, because it's the opposite of Beth and Daryl's. But we still saw similarities in order to bring out the opposite but equal traits, okay? So this is why they also had Daryl face off against Alpha in that one episode, because between the two, Alpha is more like Daryl and Beta is more like Beth. So the main things that we can see with Beta is, of course, like you said, he's a singer, and he was known as Half Moon, and he was definitely the more starry-eyed and less ruthless of the two, which I know is a funny thing to say because Beta was pretty darn ruthless, but he became that way over time. He was obviously the more artsy one because he was a singer, and I think meeting Alpha and the whole apocalypse in general kind of twisted him. So we saw a lot of Beth symbols around him, especially in the background. We would see a lot of things. And so while we were watching the episodes, we were just pointing them out a lot. You can go back through my index and look at, the analysis from season 11 episodes, and you'll see a lot of that. But probably the biggest thing that the writers did to make sure we knew that Beta was a proxy to Beth, or a foil of her, whatever you want to call it, is that they actually had Emily in real life record one of his songs. I don't know if everyone remembers that, but they were kind of interesting in the way they did it. They actually played the song with him singing, I believe, at Alexandria, and they had this scene with Tara and Jesus where they were listening to records, right? So we had to point out that it was a record because that was mentioned around Beth, not even just singing, but at Grady, she says, I don't remember the last time I heard a record. So records specifically as a means of listening to music are a symbol of her. And then we found out later in the episode that it was Beta's voice on the record, or it might not have even been the episode later in the season. I'm not sure exactly when. And he was the one who had recorded that song, and it was called The Turtle and the Monkey. And in real life, Emily recorded it and put it on one of her albums. And they actually told us that. And they made sure, I think in, The Talking Dead after the show, that we knew that this was one of Emily Kinney's songs. And they, of course, they're just presenting it as, oh, this is a fun fact. But I think that this was really so that we would, in our minds, kind of associate Beth and Alpha, that they are meant to be symbolically connected. And like I said, Daryl and Alpha were also symbolically connected. And so that whole season was kind of just meant to be an anti-parallel to Beth and Daryl. And of course, Alpha and Beta end up dying, and, the opposite is of Beth and Daryl, so we don't need to necessarily read into what happens to Alpha and Beta, because let's face it, at the end of the day, they were very brutal. They were villains. They did some very bad things, and, everyone was waiting kind of for their deaths. The other thing about Beta, though, is that when he died, So it happened in an episode, I believe it was 10-15, called The Tower. They filmed that episode at the same defunct hospital that they filmed Grady at. So that's another way to connect it to Beth. And there were tons of symbols in that episode that we were jumping at, going, oh, look at that, oh, look at that, oh, look at that, because they just put a lot of Beth and Grady symbolism in there. But the other thing I was going to say is that when he died, Daryl stabs him in the eyes with his knife, which is gross and creepy and maybe, you know, fitting for way for Beta to go out. But here's the thing. In the interview, you know, on Talking Dead or whatever it was after the episode, what they said was that Norman and Ryan, the guy who played Beta, that they came up with that, and that the writers liked it and let them keep it in. I'm not entirely sure I believe that. I've noticed this a lot on the show over the years, that they will sometimes give credit for certain ideas to the actors, but it seems like every time they do that, it just so happens to be something that is really, really on the nose with the Beth symbolism. So I'm not saying they're lying. Maybe Norman and Ryan did come up with it, but I'm telling you, the writers would not have let them use it if it was not in line with the symbolism. And it also could be that, like I said, I think that most of the actors, the mainstream ones, do know about the symbolism. They do know about Beth. So I absolutely believe Norman does. So I can see the writers also saying, come up with a way to kill him that would have something to do with Beth symbolism. And then he came up with that, you know, so I can see it being that way too, so that they're not actually lying with what they say, but they're also not telling us the whole story. I just think it's really interesting that, I know I use that word too much, he was stabbed in the eyes when there was such obvious, serious symbolism around Beth with the one-eyed dog. And that's a huge, huge symbolism of her, and it has to do with the eyes. There's also the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil theme that they use. But you can see it's another way in which Beta is kind of the opposite of her, because he died in a way that was blind. And if you watch the actual, you know, what's going on in the show plot-wise with him, he completely gives over to his madness. He's having absolute delusions at that point. And so I think it's sort of symbolic of him not seeing the world anymore for what it really is and not seeing truth. But that's also the opposite of the serious symbolism, which is all about seeing the truth, seeing what really happened, seeing what really went down, understanding something you didn't understand before, kind of awakening to a new reality that you just didn't realize was the case before. You know what I mean? So it's the opposite. I felt like they killed Beta in his delusion and he died that way, and that is very specifically the opposite of what will happen with Beth. You know, they're not just her, but Daryl, everyone's going to come to this new truth about what actually happened in season 5, and it will give them life. The truth will, you know, set them free and give them life, and bring Daryl, you know, finally his soulmate and all of that. So you can see how they kind of symbolically made it opposite. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, Beta was not connected to Beth in the plot that we know of, unless they come back around and tell us that in some way. But he was meant to be a symbolic connection to her. And like I said, a foil, equal but opposite, because obviously he was evil and Beth is not brutal and violent in the way that Beta was. And let's face it, she's a lot smaller than him. So opposite in that way too, in terms of stature. So anyway, I hope that helps. I don't have a whole lot more detail than that. Like I said, if you want to go back and read the season 11 analysis that I did, it's all in my index, and there'll be a lot more of the nitty gritty there. But again, it's like background symbols that we saw on the wall. It's details of music, details of the moon being something we see, the half moon. It's really interesting, actually, that they called him Half Moon, because we see full moons sometimes, and we've kind of realized that maybe only seeing part of the moon or the partial moon is more specifically about her, where the full moon, yeah, we're still kind of entangling it with her, but it's not as specific. It's not as quite as detailed in the entangling. But they didn't call him full moon, or they didn't call him moon. They called him half moon, which is interesting. Anyway, so yeah, if you go back and watch, what is it called? I think it's called We Are the End of the World. It's like the second episode of season 10, which is about Alpha and Beta. There definitely was a lot of symbolism there, because it was about Alpha and Beta's relationship. It was almost like a really twisted romance. Yeah, We Are the End of the World. It's episode 2. And it's super disturbing, I mean, on one hand, but it is meant to be, once again, a foil to Beth and Daryl. So it's interesting to go back and watch that episode through that lens, and you'll be surprised some of the things you pick up. So anyway, hopefully that's enough detail for you. And like I said, you can look into it some more. Go listen to Emily's song. Even the lyrics of her song are the Beta song that she recorded are interesting. You've got biblical imagery with the lamb and the lion. You've got the turtle and the monkey. We've talked about monkeys before. The turtle kind of became a symbol of her and Daryl because of the little turtle that Norman saved for her. It talks about not being immune, which in the song, it's not about physical immunity. It's more about emotional immunity. But still, there's some interesting words and some interesting word choices in that song, which is, I 100% think, why they used it for the show and had Emily record it. And so you can just see a lot of really interesting things swirling around Beta and that storyline and what it means for Beth. So yeah, hopefully that helps. And yeah, everyone have a fabulous day. We'll be back with more soon.